Hello everybody, it's Tuesday morning and I'm Financial Eyes, going for a walk to Fetter Lane near Farringdon because I want to take you to a statue which I think I've seen before, but I didn't really understand what it was all about. It's of a man called John Wilkes. John Wilkes apparently was kicked out of Parliament 250 years ago this month. So he was known as a radical. Apparently he was the ugliest man in England, and he was what is known as a Whig, which I don't know too much about, but apparently he was a radical MP. Don't know if he was a Conservative or not. And he believed that the voters, his own voters, should be allowed to choose who their representatives were, now as opposed to Parliament. Now I don't know what that means, whether that means that they should be allowed to choose the cabinet, or whether the MP himself was voted on by wealthy people as opposed to the people who lived in that place. If this is to do with rotten boroughs. Either way, he stood for more representation of people, and in a way maybe that lives on in the philosophy of the will of the people crowd, some way, though I don't agree with all of what they say. In some of the referendum Brexit people who say there was a referendum, people said this, let's stick to it instead of having it overruled. The other thing that's quite interesting about this man John Wilkes is that whilst he was pretty radical as a young man when he was kicked out of Parliament, etc., and he took the side of the American rebels in the 1780s during the War of Independence, even though that was what he stood for, in later life he joined the City of London and the Bank of England, and apparently, as well as being a poet and apparently the ugliest man in England, he ordered the soldiers, or the police, the military, to shoot protesters who had decided to storm the Bank of England in 1780. So his statue is here in London at Fetter Lane, and I'm just going to go and have a look at it and see how he is remembered today. So he was the MP for Aylesbury, which is currently presided over by David Lidington, who's the Deputy Prime Minister, and isn't far, I don't think, from wherever John Bercow is, Buckinghamshire somewhere, and who's the other one? Dominic Grieve. So would Wilkes have been a Brexiteer or a Remainer? I'm sure he'd have been a Brexiteer, and on the basis that if he was a City of London man, although they campaigned for Remain, I think they're very, very Brexit now with the DUP, etc. So yeah, 250 years ago this month, he was kicked out of Parliament, which I'm sure meant something at the time. Be interesting to see if it's reported in papers, I don't know. Oh yeah, that's it. I think the other thing that I read about him in Wikipedia was that he campaigned for, and I think he secured this, for all proceedings in Parliament to be reported verbatim. So, as someone who's interested in freedom of information and transparency, that's another reason why I should be looking up to him, because he sort of paved the way. I think it was later repealed in some form and is back, but with some exceptions. So, yeah, in a way he was a transparency campaigner as well. Tomorrow, Wednesday, at 6 o'clock, 5:30 I think, there's going to be a book launch at a place called Congress House, and that is for a book by Janine Booth about Minnie Lansbury. Minnie Lansbury, who was an alderman, so a councillor, at the London Borough of Poplar in 1919, and in 1921, because she and her father-in-law George Lansbury and other people at the council. I think it was a Labour council. They kind of swept to power in 1919 after World War I, and they decided that men and women should be paid equally, and that everything should be done to alleviate the poverty from unemployment, etc., that people were suffering in the ward. And of course, there was huge amounts of immigration as well, people fleeing persecution, anti-Semitic persecution from Russia and all of these other places. So apparently she was, according to the Morning Star article that I read yesterday, this is quite funny actually, because the Morning Star I think is quite pro-Russia, which isn't that surprising given the Russian Revolution, etc. It's quite pro-Russia, and it's talking in the article yesterday about anti-Semitism, and that's sort of within the Jewish community. They're sort of talking about how the Jewish Chronicle back then, like today, was a conservative operation, and it apparently didn't like her. It didn't like Millie Lansbury, that is. Anyway, she went to jail. This is because they said that the system for council tax was one where they had to pay the council tax, or the rates I think they called it, back to central government. So they collected it locally, paid it back to central government, and then some of it would be given back to them. And I think what happened was they noticed that Kensington was paying the same and receiving more, or the percentage that they paid at Kensington was the same, but the amount they got back was more. There was some injustice that they noticed to do with the figures, and so they said, fine, we're in trouble, so what we're going to do is, because your system's unfair, all the money that we raise we're going to keep. And they got into a lot of trouble for that. In fact, they went to jail. So they put the councillors in jail. That's quite interesting that happened, and that this book launch is coming up. Janine Booth works for the, is it TfL? RMT, the Transport Union. And she just set up this weekend with other people the Neurodiversity Labour Group. So this is a Labour Party group for people with autism. She's written books about public-private partnerships, PFIs, PPPs, in London Underground, Metronet, that type of thing, which was a consortia of companies that privatised them cheap. It didn't work very well. So yeah, she's a smart woman. And 10 years ago, she wrote a book called Guilty and Proud about the Poplar Rates Rebellion. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see her talk tomorrow. I've seen a YouTube video that she did that was fantastic. And she's got Clive Lewis to write the intro to the book, which I read the other day. It's very good. So it's interesting for me going for a walk in London today, thinking of John Wilkes from 250 years ago and Minnie Lansbury. Oh, I forgot to say, the ultra tragic end to Minnie Lansbury is that when they